Eleanor Grace Fenwick Harcourt did not scream. She did not weep. She did not ask to be let back inside. She stood on the frozen gravel of the carriage sweep at Ashcombe Park, with her daughter wrapped against her chest, not yet 9 hours old, and she counted the windows that had gone dark against her, one by one, the way she had once counted rows in her father's ledgers, and found the sum came to all of them. Behind her the front door was already shut. She had heard the bolt go home. In her hand, though her fingers had gone past feeling, she held the ring of household keys that had hung at her waist every day of her marriage, brass, cold, worn smooth at the teeth from 4 generations of hands before hers, and she did not drop them. And she did not fling them into the dark, in the manner of a woman in a story, and she did not beg to keep them. She only closed her fist around them until the metal bit, because it was the one thing on her person that still told the truth about who she was, whatever the house behind her had just decided. By spring, the county would use a different word for her than the one Augusta Harcourt had used on the porch that night. But that was months away, and worth nothing to her yet. The particular stillness of a woman deciding not to fall down was, Eleanor would later think, the only kind of courage nobody ever wrote a hymn about. She turned from the house. She began, very carefully, on legs that did not entirely belong to her yet, to walk. If you have ever done everything asked of you, and been told, in the end, that doing it was all you were ever for, stay a while. Subscribe to the channel, and let's find out what she does next. The county called it Ashcombe weather, that particular February, a cold that came in off the low fields and sat in the stone of the great houses for a week at a stretch, indifferent to who it found in it. Ashcombe Park had worn that cold well for 300 years, ever since a Harcourt had first raised its walls on a rise above the river, and the family had gone on calling it theirs long after the money that kept a roof honest had run out from under them. It had run out, in fact, 9 years before Eleanor's daughter was born, in the person of a mortgage note held by a Manchester mill owner named Josiah Fenwick, who had bought the debt from a failing bank, not for spite, but because it was, by his own accounting, a sound and undervalued asset. He might have foreclosed. Instead, he had come to look at the house himself, walked its cold halls with his hat in his hands, and made old Mr. Edmund Harcourt an offer that let the family keep its name on the gate a while longer. Fenwick would hold the deed, quietly, and in time his daughter would marry the Harcourt heir, and the county would be told only what it needed to be told, which was that 2 good families had joined their fortunes. It was, Josiah Fenwick told his lawyer, Mr. Aldous Prue, the only kind of charity a sensible man practised, the kind with paper behind it. Eleanor had been 19, she had not been unwilling. Julian Harcourt, at 21, had been quiet and correct, and had looked at her exactly once across her father's dinner table, with an expression she would spend the next 4 years trying, and failing, to read as anything warmer than an inventory being taken. She learned, in that time, the precise shape of being necessary. She learned the estate's rent rolls because no one else troubled to check them. She learned which tenant families were owed patience and which were owed a firm hand, and she gave each the correct measure without being thanked for either. She ran the house on a budget that would have embarrassed the Harcourt's old extravagance, and Augusta Harcourt, Julian's mother, took the savings and never once asked where they had come from. Eleanor was, in the accounting that mattered most in that house, useful. She had simply never been told, in 4 years, that she was anything more. Her father died in the 3rd year of it, of a fever that took him in 11 days, and left behind a will that Mr. Prue read aloud in the Ashcombe morning room to a room of solemn faces, a will that named Julian as master of Ashcombe Park in all the ways the county could see, and named in a codicil sealed separately and not read aloud that day, something else entirely. Eleanor did not know the codicil existed, neither did Julian, neither, most crucially, did Augusta. What Eleanor knew in the winter her daughter was born was this, that she had spent 4 years being efficient in a house that had never once asked her opinion on anything it considered important, that her husband spoke to her the way a man speaks to a steward he trusts, but does not confide in, and that Augusta Harcourt had watched her carry a child to term with the same expression she gave the household accounts, approval of a function performed correctly, and nothing beyond it. The labour had been long and hard, 2 days and part of a third, and in the worst hour of it, with the midwife's face gone tight and Eleanor's own strength burning down to an ember, she had heard, through the wall, in the particular acoustic cruelty of old houses, her mother-in-law's voice pitched low to someone in the corridor. If it lives, well, if she does not, we are not, I think, greatly the poorer for it. She has done the one thing required of her. A pause filled by nothing. Julian will grieve properly. He always does things properly. Eleanor had not died. Her daughter had not died. Both facts seemed, in retrospect, to have inconvenienced no one so much as they inconvenienced Augusta's arithmetic. The child came at 4 in the morning, small and furious and entirely whole, and Eleanor held her and wept, the only tears of the whole ordeal, and she would not begrudge herself those, and slept 2 hours out of pure animal necessity, and woke to find Augusta standing over the bed with a folded shawl in her hands, not for the baby. "You will want to gather what is yours," Augusta said. "I have had Dunmore pack a trunk. Nothing extravagant. You understand the estate cannot spare it." Eleanor did not understand, not yet, not fully, and asked her to say it plainly. Augusta said it plainly. She said that a woman who had given the county cause to whisper, and there had been whispering, manufactured whispering, seeded by a land agent named Silas Crane over the preceding month, about a supposed indiscretion during Julian's absence in Bristol, whispering Eleanor had not even known was loose in the world until it was used against her. Such a woman could not remain under the same roof as a newborn heir, and a mother who valued that heir's name above all things. She said Julian was from home on business, and would not return before morning. She said the decision, in his absence, was hers to make, as it had always, in practice, been hers to make. She said, "You have done your duty, Eleanor. That is all that was ever asked of you." And Eleanor, who had spent 4 years cataloguing every insult small enough to swallow, found this one, at last, too large. She did not argue. She had learned, from her father's ledgers if nowhere else, that arguing with a person who controls the room is a poor use of a scarce resource. She rose, dressed as steadily as her body allowed, wrapped her daughter, and walked past Augusta Harcourt, with the household keys still at her waist, because Augusta had not thought in her hurry to ask for them back before the door was already shutting behind her. She stood a long moment on the gravel. Then she began to walk toward the gatehouse at the eastern edge of the park, where an old man named Hob Latimer, her father's former steward, had lived alone since Josiah Fenwick's death. Keeper of a lodge nobody important remembered was there. He opened the door before she knocked. He had heard, from a stable boy running errands nobody had authorized, what was happening at the great house, and he had banked the fire high in expectation. Miss Eleanor, he said. He had never once, in 4 years, learned to call her Mrs. Harcourt, and she had never corrected him. He looked at the bundle in her arms and at her face, and did not ask the obvious question. "Come in out of it, then, you and the little one both." She went in out of it. Hob Latimer's lodge had 2 rooms, a fire that smoked when the wind came from the north, and exactly one book, which was a ledger, his own, kept faithfully for 30 years out of a habit no one had ever thought to break him of, recording the small transactions of a man with almost nothing left to record. Eleanor sat by his fire with her daughter asleep against her shoulder, and understood, in the particular clarity that comes after a long labour and a longer cruelty, that she had exactly 3 assets left in the world: a child, a name nobody currently wanted, and a habit of mind her father had given her before he died, which was the habit of writing everything down. She allowed herself grief in careful measure. She had decided this in the first hour, lying rigid in Hobe's spare bed with the baby warm against her and the fire ticking low. She would grant herself exactly 20 minutes a day, no more, in which she was permitted to feel the whole of it. The shut door, the cold gravel, the sentence about duty, and beyond those 20 minutes she would work, because grief unrationed was a debt that compounded. And she had spent 4 years learning what unchecked debt did to a house. "I want paper," she told Hob, the second morning, once the baby was fed and sleeping, and Eleanor's hands had stopped their small private tremor. "And ink, if you have it, and I want to know exactly what is owed to whom on this estate, because I do not believe for one moment that Silas Crane's rent books add up the way they are meant to." Hob Latimer, who had kept books under Josiah Fenwick for 20 years and trusted no man who couldn't show his sums, allowed himself something that was not quite a smile. "I've thought the very same for a 12-month, he said. Never had the standing to say it out loud. "I don't imagine I have much standing myself this morning," Eleanor said. "No," Hob agreed. "But you've got a fair hand, a level head, and nothing left to lose by looking close. That's more standing than most men in this county ever start with." Eleanor named her daughter Josephine, for her father, before the week was out. In a christening so quiet it was attended by exactly 4 people: herself, Hob Latimer, the local curate, and Dr. Whitfield, the parish physician, who had delivered half the tenant children on the estate, and had come, unasked, to see for himself that mother and infant were sound, because a rumour of hysteria had reached him too, and he did not believe a word of it. "I've attended you twice now, Mrs. Harcourt, doctor," Whitfield said, folding his stethoscope away, "once for the birth, and once, unofficially, to satisfy my own curiosity about a rumour I find frankly insulting to my professional judgment. You are the soundest patient I have seen this winter. Whoever is putting it about that you are unwell has never once asked me." "No," Eleanor said. "They wouldn't have. The truth wasn't the point of it." She began, that same week, on the tenant rolls. It was slow work at first, done at Hob's small table by candlelight, with Josephine asleep in a drawer, padded with what linens Eleanor had managed to bring away, and it did not feel, in those early days, like anything a person could call a campaign. It felt like arithmetic, which was the only feeling Eleanor entirely trusted. She started with the Marsh farm, at the western boundary, because Tom Marsh's wife had once, 2 winters back, brought Eleanor a basket of eggs unasked, and because Eleanor remembered, the way she remembered most things concerning money, that the Marsh's rent had gone up 11% at Michaelmas, for reasons nobody had troubled to explain to them. She walked to the Marsh farm with Josephine bound against her in a length of linen, and asked Tom Marsh to show her his receipts. "Begging pardon, Mrs. Harcourt," Tom Marsh said, hat in his hands, glancing past her as though expecting Ashcombe's great house to materialise and object. "But I heard you were sent away." "I was," Eleanor said. "That doesn't change whether your rent is fair. May I see the receipts?" He showed her. It took her 40 minutes at his kitchen table, working with a pencil stub and the back of an old seed catalogue, to find what she suspected. The rent had indeed risen 11%. But the estate's own rolls, which Hob had once been permitted to copy, in the days before Silas Crane made copying difficult, showed a rise of only 4%, authorised by Julian's signature. The remaining 7% had gone nowhere anyone could account for, except into whatever ledger Silas Crane kept for himself. £7, 4 shillings, over the 12-month, Eleanor said finally, turning the catalogue around so Tom Marsh could see her sum. "That you have paid, and were never asked to pay by anyone with the right to ask it. I would want that back, if I were you. In writing, and soon, before Mr. Crane has time to make the books tidy again." Tom Marsh looked at the sum for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You did that in your head near as much as on the paper," he said. "It was not quite a question." "My father taught me," Eleanor said. "He always said a woman who could read a ledger could never entirely be lied to. I didn't understand, at the time, how much use I'd have for it." Word of the Marsh rent travelled the way water moves downhill, finding every low place in the county without anyone appearing to carry it there. By the following market day, 3 more tenant families had brought their receipts to the gatehouse, laid out on Hobb's small table like offerings, and Eleanor had begun, without ever deciding to begin it, the work that would occupy the whole of the coming year, proving, family by family, farm by farm, exactly what Ashcombe Park owed the people who had built its harvests, and exactly how much of it had gone missing under a name that was not, in truth, the name that owned the land at all, though not one of them. Least of all Eleanor, yet knew that last part to be true. Julian Harcourt returned from Bristol on the 3rd day to find his wife gone, his mother serene, and an infant daughter he had not been present to greet asleep in a nursery his mother had already, with characteristic efficiency, restaffed. "She has gone to recover her strength with relations," Augusta told him, over breakfast, in the tone she used for weather. "It was thought best. You know how delicate these confinements can leave a woman. We will send for her when she is entirely well." Julian, who had learned at 17 not to ask his mother a question twice if the first answer had already closed the subject, did not ask twice. He went up to the nursery instead, and stood a long while looking down at a daughter who did not yet know his face, and felt, though he would not have had a word for it that morning, having been raised carefully out of the habit of naming what he felt, something that was not quite unease and not quite grief, but stood very close to both, and would not leave him alone. Ashcombe Park's rent rolls, as it happened, told 2 separate stories that spring, and only one of them was written down. The official story, kept in Silas Crane's fine copperplate hand in the estate office, showed a modest, respectable revenue, tenants paying what tenants had always paid, the land agent's own commission drawn correctly, and no more. It was the story Julian saw when he glanced, as he occasionally did, at the ledger open on Crane's desk. It was tidy. It was plausible. It was, in the particular way of documents built to survive only a glance, entirely false in its particulars. The second story existed in scraps, in receipts kept in kitchen drawers by tenant wives who did not entirely trust paper, but trusted it more than memory. In the seed catalogue margins where Eleanor had first done her sums, and increasingly, as spring came on, in a ledger of her own that she had begun keeping properly. Bound in a cover Hob had made her from a scrap of tanned hide, its first page headed in her clear hand, Ashcombe Park, an accounting of what is owed. She did not yet know she had any right to demand it be paid. By April, 6 tenant families had brought her their books. By May she had found, cross-referenced against the estate's own harvest records from 3 years back, records Hob had quietly preserved, out of the same instinct that made him keep his own accounts faithful, a pattern too consistent to be accident. Silas Crane had been skimming, in small and defensible increments, a sum that Eleanor's most conservative estimate put at close to £200 a year, for at least 4 years running, long before Eleanor had come to Ashcombe as a bride. Long enough that Crane had grown confident in the invisibility of small numbers, the particular safety of a fraud too modest, on any single farm to draw the eye. "He's cleverer than most men give a land agent credit for being," Hobbs said, studying the tallies by candlelight, "and greedier than most men manage to stay for 4 years running without slipping. He'll have slipped somewhere. Men like Crane always do. Sooner or later they get comfortable, and comfortable men stop checking their own sums." "Then I mean to find where," Eleanor said. She had, by then, stopped thinking of the work as revenge, which was a relief to her, because revenge had never sat comfortably in her hands the way a ledger did. She thought of it, instead, the way her father had taught her to think of any imbalance in a book, as an error demanding correction, nothing more, nothing less, and the fact that the error happened to have a face and a name and a habit of smiling warmly at tenants he was quietly robbing, did not, to Eleanor's mind, change the fundamental nature of the task. It was in June that Julian first came to the gatehouse. He did not announce it. He simply appeared, one warm evening, at Hob Latimer's door, hat in hand in a way Eleanor had never once seen him hold it in 4 years of marriage, and stood on the threshold as though the door-frame itself might refuse him passage. "I heard," he said, "that you have been going over the tenant accounts." "I have," Eleanor said. She did not rise from the table where Josephine lay sleeping in a basket at her feet. "You are welcome to see the results, if you've come for them." He had not, in fact, come for the results. He had come, though it took him the better part of 10 minutes, standing in Hob's small doorway to arrive at saying so, because Tom Marsh had thanked him, unprompted, in the lane outside the church, for £7 4 that Julian had never authorised returning, and did not, until that moment, know had been returned at all. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about the rents, about any of it." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I don't imagine you did. You've never once looked at Mr. Crane's books yourself, have you? It was not quite an accusation." It was. Julian understood with the particular discomfort of a man encountering an unfamiliar and precise instrument, simply true. "My mother handles the estate correspondence," he said. "It has always been managed for me. I was taught the figures mattered less than the name holding them steady." "That's a strange thing to teach a man who'll one day have to feed a county off those figures," Eleanor said, not unkindly, and went back to her ledger and did not offer him a chair, because she had not yet decided whether he had earned one. He came back the following week, and the week after. He did not, in those visits, say much that mattered. He watched his daughter sleep, sometimes for whole quarter hours without speaking, and once Eleanor noted it in the private ledger she kept in her own mind, the one that recorded not shillings but small evidences. He reached into the basket and let Josephine's fist close around one finger, and something crossed his face that was not quite an almost smile, but stood adjacent to where one might eventually be found. "You've never asked me to come back," he said, on the 4th visit, watching her write. "No," Eleanor agreed. I haven't. Do you mean to? I mean, Eleanor said, setting down her pen with the particular deliberate stillness she had perfected on a gravel drive in February, to finish what I've started. After that, we'll see what there is to ask. It was not warmth, precisely, but it was the first time in 4 years he had asked her a question, and waited, without visible impatience, for the whole of her answer, and Eleanor, who had learned to measure affection in units too small for most people to notice, marked it down, in the ledger she kept only in her own mind, as the beginning of something she was not yet willing to name. Julian Harcourt had been 15 the year his father died, and he had spent the 11 years since arranging the memory of it into a shape he could live inside, without flinching. The shape went like this. Edmund Harcourt had been a generous man, a soft man, a man who forgave tenant debts out of sentiment and extended credit to friends out of loyalty, and had, through a slow accumulation of kindnesses the county still spoke of fondly, ruined the family that trusted him. He had died of a fever contracted, the story went, from insisting on nursing a tenant's sick child himself rather than sending for the doctor and waiting at a comfortable distance, a final, fatal act of the same softness that had already cost them everything else. Augusta had knelt at his bedside, and, according to the version of the story Julian had been given, piece by piece across his adolescence, had understood in that hour the single lesson she meant to spend the rest of her life teaching her son, that love, undisciplined, was simply another word for a debt a family could not afford. She had raised him, from 15 onward, on arithmetic instead of affection. She had sent him to a strict uncle's counting house for 2 years to learn that figures did not forgive and should not be asked to. She had chosen his wife for her father's solvency, and had taught him, in 100 small unspoken lessons, that a wife's worth was best measured the same way a mortgage was measured, by what she secured against ruin, not by what she felt. Julian had never once, in 11 years, questioned whether the lesson was sound. He had simply lived inside it, the way a man lives inside a house built before his birth, accepting its draughts as the natural order of walls. It was Eleanor's ledger, 3 months of it, laid out with a clarity his mother's correspondence had never once approached, that first put a crack in the plaster. Your father forgave Tom Marsh's grandfather a debt in a hard winter 30 years back, Eleanor told him, one July evening, turning a page. I found the record in Hobe's old books. The Marsh farm has paid Ashcombe back double that sum in loyalty alone since, stayed through 2 bad harvests, when men with less reason went to the towns instead. That's not arithmetic your mother ever taught you to do. But it's arithmetic all the same. It simply keeps its accounts over a longer term than she has patience for. Julian said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the light was going gold and low across the gatehouse garden, and Josephine, awake for once, watched her father's face with the frank, unembarrassed attention only infants and honest people manage. She told me kindness killed him, he said finally. She never once told me it was the fever that killed him, and the fever came from 100 causes, and my father happened to also be kind. She taught me they were the same thing. Cause and character. I have spent 11 years afraid of my own gentler instincts, because I was told they were the instrument of his death. They weren't, Eleanor said. It was not gentle, the way she said it. It was simply certain, the way she said most things she had checked twice against the facts. Grief looks for somewhere to put the blame. Your mother put it on the one part of your father she was afraid to admit she'd loved best. That isn't arithmetic, Julian. That's just old pain, wearing arithmetic's coat because the coat fit better than admitting the pain. He looked at her for a long time after that, in a way that made Eleanor set down her pen entirely. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who isn't afraid of that," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "But you've started asking the question out loud, which is more than you managed in 4 years of marriage. I'll take that as a beginning, if you mean it as one." The county, meanwhile, had begun, slowly, the way a tide turns, with a great deal of water still moving in the old direction before anyone notices the change. To speak of Eleanor Harcourt differently than it had in February. It was Mrs. Coombs, the midwife, who first said it plainly at the market, to 3 other women within easy hearing of a 4th who would carry it further, that whatever anyone had heard about hysteria and indiscretion, she herself had attended that birth, and there had not been one true word of it. And moreover that Eleanor Harcourt had, in 5 months, done more for the tenant families of Ashcombe than the estate office had managed in the previous 5 years, and folk who wished to keep gossiping about her character might do better to go and ask Tom Marsh what he thought of it. It was a small thing, said once, in a market square. But small things, said enough times in enough kitchens, had a way of becoming the thing everyone had apparently always believed. Silas Crane, watching his careful arrangements come under a scrutiny he had never once anticipated from the direction of a gatehouse, began, that same July, to prepare a defence of his own, one that would, before autumn, require paper of a different and far more dangerous kind than rent receipts. And in a locked drawer in Mr. Aldersprew's chambers in the county town, a codicil sealed the year Josiah Fenwick died, sat exactly where it had sat for 4 years, waiting only for someone to ask the right question, in the right voice, for its existence to matter to anyone at all. The letter from Mr. Aldersprew arrived at the gatehouse on a Thursday in August, brought by a boy on a borrowed pony, who would not leave until he had watched Eleanor break the seal herself. "Your circumstances having, I am given to understand, materially altered since your father's passing, and a clause of his will providing expressly for such an alteration, I judge it now proper, indeed overdue, that you attend upon me at your earliest convenience regarding a codicil sealed at the time of the reading, and by your father's express instruction. Withheld from disclosure except upon such conditions as have now, I believe, been met." Eleanor read it twice. Then she asked Hob to mind Josephine, put on her one good bonnet, and walked the 3 miles into the county town before the letter's ink was properly dry in her memory. Mr. Prue was a small, precise man who kept his office the way Eleanor kept her ledger, and he received her with the particular gravity of a man who had waited 4 years to say something, and meant to say it correctly. "Your father," he said, once she was seated, "was, as I am sure you are aware, not a sentimental man in his business dealings, though he loved you a great deal in the ordinary way a father loves a daughter. When he purchased the mortgage on Ashcombe Park, and later arranged your marriage as the means of settling it honourably, he did one thing more, which he asked me to keep entirely from the family until such time as it became necessary. He did not trust, forgive me, Mrs. Harcourt. These are his words, not mine. He did not trust that a family so long accustomed to considering an estate its birthright would treat a daughter-in-law kindly, once her usefulness to that birthright seemed spent. He said, and I copied it down at his dictation so that I should have his exact words, "I have seen what such families do to women once the transaction is complete. I mean my daughter to own the ground under her own feet, whatever anyone else believes of it, so that she is never again dependent on being wanted." He drew a folded document from a drawer and set it before her. "The freehold of Ashcombe Park," he said, "passed by your father's will directly to you, Mrs. Harcourt, upon his death, held in trust and undisclosed only until, in my judgment as executor, disclosure became necessary to protect you. I confess I judged that moment had not yet come, in the ordinary run of family friction, until word reached me this spring of the circumstances of your daughter's birth, and of what was said to you upon the gravel of your own front drive. I am satisfied, now, that the moment has come. Ashcombe Park is yours, Mrs. Harcourt. It has been yours for 4 years. Every soul presently living beneath its roof, including your husband, including his mother, lives there because you have not yet chosen to tell them otherwise." Eleanor sat very still with the document in her lap for a long moment, and the room did not move, and outside a cart went by in the street with an ordinary indifferent rattle, as though the whole of her life had not just quietly inverted itself. "Does my husband know," she asked finally, "that his mother has been living all this time on the charity of a woman she threw into the snow with a 9-hour-old infant?" "He does not," Mr. Prue said. "No one does, save myself, your late father, and now yourself." "Then I would like," Eleanor said, and her voice did not shake, though something in her chest had gone very tight and very full, some time to decide how that should be told. "I did not build what I've built these 5 months in order to win an argument, Mr. Prue. I built it to prove something the ledgers should have shown from the start. I mean to finish proving it properly, in its own time, and not simply produce this like a trick played at cards." Mr. Prue, who had spent 4 years quietly admiring a woman he had never once been permitted to say a word to, allowed himself the smallest bow of approval. "Your father," he said, "would have approved of that entirely. It is, if I may say so, exactly how he would have played the hand himself." She walked home with the document folded inside her bodice, against her heart, the whole 3 miles, and did not tell Julian that night, nor Hob, nor anyone, though Hob watched her come in with an expression on her face he had not seen there before, and did not ask what had put it there, trusting she would tell him when telling served a purpose. That night, once Josephine was asleep, Eleanor took her mother's old chatelaine. The ring of household keys Augusta had never thought to reclaim from her waist on the gravel, in February, and laid it on the table before her, and looked at it a long while. It had been, all these months, simply a thing she carried out of habit, evidence of a role stripped from her the same night it was given weight by a birth. Now, with Mr. Prue's document warm against her ribs, she understood it differently. It was not a symbol of a house she had lost. It had never, in the truest accounting, belonged to anyone but her to begin with. She did not put it away. She hung it, that night, on a nail by Hobb's door, where anyone who came in or out would have to pass beneath it, and she left it there, and went to bed, and slept for the first time in months, without counting her 20 minutes of grief before she allowed herself to close her eyes. Silas Crane's counterattack, when it came dressed as concern. He had watched, through the summer, the tide he could not turn, and had done what men of his particular cleverness generally do when a slow erosion threatens to become a flood. He went looking for a document large enough to drown the smaller ones. He found it, or rather manufactured it, in the form of a codicil of his own, forged, in a hand that mimicked old Edmund Harcourt's with real skill, purporting to show that the Ashcombe rents had been formally restructured, years before, with the elder Harcourt's own authority, in a manner that made every figure Eleanor had assembled merely the operation of an agreement nobody now living could dispute, because the only man who might have disputed it was a decade in his grave. It was clever. It was also, Eleanor discovered within an hour of Hob laying eyes on it, wrong in one particular a forger careless of ink could not help but be wrong about. The paper Crane had used, procured from the estate's own stock, bore a watermark the mill had not begun producing until 3 years after old Harcourt's death. "He's caught himself on his own vanity," Hob said, holding the sheet to the light with the grim satisfaction of a man who had waited a long while for exactly this. Wanted good paper for his lie. Should have used something older and dirtier. Augusta Harcourt, for her part, moved that same week to settle a different matter entirely, and moved to settle it before her son's growing softness toward his estranged wife could complicate it further. She petitioned, quietly, through a lawyer of her own choosing, to have herself declared Josephine's legal guardian on the grounds, sworn to under a physician she had paid to swear it. That Eleanor's conduct since the birth showed a persistent instability unsuited to the raising of an heir. It was, Eleanor understood when the notice reached her, meant to frighten her into retreat before the harvest assembly at which the county's disputes were traditionally aired and settled. It did not frighten her. It simply told her, with a clarity Augusta had not intended, precisely how much was now at stake, and precisely how little her mother-in-law understood of what documentation Eleanor had, by then, assembled in a hide-bound ledger that filled 2/3 of its pages. "She means to move before we're ready," Hob said. "No," Eleanor said, closing the ledger with a quiet final sound. "She means to move because she's noticed we're nearly ready, and it frightens her. That's not the same thing at all. We'll be ready in time. And we'll be ready in front of everyone who matters, not in some private room where her lawyer can manage the room the way Cranes managed the books." She sent word, through Hob, to Mr. Prue, and to Dr. Whitfield, and to Tom Marsh, and to 4 other tenant families whose receipts now filled her ledger's pages, that the county's harvest assembly, held that year at the tithe barn on Michaelmas Eve, would be an excellent occasion for certain matters to be aired before witnesses who could not later be told they had misremembered. The tithe barn stood full to its rafters on Michaelmas Eve, farmers and their wives, the curate, Dr. Whitfield, Mr. Prue with a leather case under his arm, and, at the front, on a raised dais built for exactly this purpose once a year, Augusta Harcourt in her best black, with her lawyer beside her, and a triumphant patience on her face that Eleanor recognised, having worn something like it herself across a great many careful months. Julian stood near his mother and did not yet know, when the proceedings opened, which way his own future was about to turn. Augusta's lawyer spoke first, laying out with practised smoothness the petition for guardianship, the physician's sworn statement, the general and regrettable necessity of protecting an infant heir from a mother whose conduct since the birth had, by all report, shown troubling irregularity. "I would ask," Eleanor said, rising when he had finished, in a voice that did not need to be raised to carry to the barn's far rafters, "what conduct, precisely? I have spent the summer collecting rent receipts and correcting a land agent's arithmetic. If that is irregular, I confess I do not know what regular looks like on this estate, since no one troubled to show me an honest set of books before I made my own." A ripple went through the barn, not laughter, quite, but something adjacent to it, the sound of a room recalibrating its sympathies in real time. "You will forgive us," the lawyer said, smooth as poured cream, "if hearsay from tenants does not constitute—" "It is not hearsay," Eleanor said. "It is documentation. Mr. Prue, if you would." What followed took the better part of an hour, and no one in the barn moved to leave before it was finished. Mr. Prue laid out, in the plain procedural language of a man who had waited 4 years to use it, the terms of Josiah Fenwick's will, the codicil, the freehold of Ashcombe Park resting, and having rested since the elder Fenwick's death, in the name of Eleanor Grace Fenwick Harcourt alone. He laid beside it Eleanor's own ledger, 5 months of tenant receipts cross-checked against the estate's official rolls, and the discrepancy, some £211 across 4 years, set out in a hand so clear the figures needed no interpreting. He laid beside that the forged codicil, and the watermark, and a second document he had obtained that week from the paper mill itself, confirming the date that particular stock had first gone into production, 3 full years after the death of the man whose signature the forgery claimed. Then, one by one, without summons, in the manner the style of the county's own justice had always half expected and half dreaded, working men rose from among the benches to say what they knew. Tom Marsh spoke of £7 4 returned and then, this last month, quietly demanded back again by Mr. Crane, under a new and unexplained pretext, demanded and refused, because the Marsh family had, by then, learned to keep their own receipts. 2 more tenant families spoke after him. Briefly, plainly, the way honest men speak when they have nothing to gain from a lie, and everything to lose from staying silent. Silas Crane, standing near the barn's side door, with the particular stillness of a man calculating whether the door was still an option, found, when Mr. Prue turned to address him directly on the matter of the watermark, that the door was no longer an option at all. Something in his face, which had held all summer a warmth Eleanor now understood to have been entirely deliberate, simply went out, the way a lamp goes out when the oil is finally spent. Augusta Harcourt did not shout. She was not, Eleanor thought, watching her, a woman who had ever needed to shout to get what she wanted, that had always been the danger of her. But her hands, folded in her lap, had gone entirely white at the knuckle, and her composure, held so long and so carefully, had begun, visibly, to cost her something to maintain. "I could," Eleanor said, when the barn had gone quiet enough for her voice to reach every corner of it, "ask the magistrate present tonight to remove every person from Ashcombe Park who has, this year, conspired to defraud its tenants, or to take a 9-hour-old infant from her mother's arms on a February night. I have the standing to ask it. I believe, after tonight, no one in this room would say I lacked the proof." She let that sit a moment. Julian, beside his mother, had gone very still, his eyes on Eleanor and nowhere else. "I am not going to ask it," Eleanor said. "Mr. Crane will make full restitution of every shilling this ledger shows him owing, under Mr. Prue's supervision, and he will not hold a position of trust on any estate in this county again, that much the tenants he robbed are owed, and I will not soften it for anyone's comfort." As for the rest, she looked, finally, at Augusta. "I did not build this year's work in order to put a woman of 60 out into weather, she taught me, better than anyone, exactly how cold could be. I mean to see her housed, decently, and I mean for her to understand, from this night forward, precisely whose grace that housing is offered under. That is not forgiveness, Mrs. Harcourt. I am not there yet, and I will not pretend to you that I am. It is only mercy, which I find I can afford, and which costs me considerably less than hatred would." The tithe barn, in the long silence that followed, did what county rooms do at the end of a reckoning. It turned, all at once and without further debate, and the turning was audible in the particular way a room's held breath becomes, released, something closer to a sigh. Julian's accounting, when it came 3 days after the harvest assembly, in the gatehouse, with Josephine asleep between them in her basket and the ring of chatelaine keys still hanging on its nail by the door. He did not offer her an apology first. He had learned enough in 5 months of quarter-hour visits to know she would want the explanation before she would accept the sorrow. And so he gave her the explanation in full: his father's death, his mother's doctrine, the counting-house, the 11 years spent believing that warmth was simply the unpaid interest on a debt that eventually came due. He told her about the night of Josephine's birth, that he had, in fact, been delayed in Bristol by a matter his mother had arranged to delay him with, a piece of business timed with a precision he had not, until this week, understood to be deliberate. "That is an explanation," Eleanor said, when he had finished. "It is not yet an apology. They are different things, Julian, and I find I require both, in their proper order, or neither means very much." He was quiet a moment. Then he said it, not performed, not polished, the words coming out somewhat roughly, as though he had never before in his life had occasion to practice them. "I am sorry. Not sorry that circumstances were difficult. Sorry that I let a house teach me not to look at you long enough to see what you were. And sorry that when you needed me most, I was 3 counties away arranging exactly the kind of transaction my mother raised me to value over you. That is the whole of it. I don't ask you to accept it tonight." "All right," Eleanor said. "All right," he said, and something in his face, cautious and unpractised, moved toward hope. "All right that I've heard it," Eleanor said, "and all right that it's a beginning. Not all right that it settles anything. If you want the rest, Julian, you'll show me. Not tonight, and not with more words. Show me over time the way you'd prove a ledger sound, not by one grand entry, but by every ordinary day's small figures adding up honestly. Then tell me the terms," he said, "and I'll meet them." She had them ready. She had, in fact, drafted them the way she drafted everything of consequence, in writing, the night after the harvest assembly, while Josephine slept, and she recited them now with the same plain clarity she had used on every ledger that summer. Her name would stand beside his on every document concerning Ashcombe Park, publicly, from this day forward, not as a courtesy, but as the fact the freehold had always made true. The tenant wage structure she had built through the summer, fair rates fixed and published, not left to a land agent's discretion, would remain in place permanently, whoever managed the land day to day. She would return to the great house when she judged herself ready to, and not one day before, and no one, not Julian, not his mother, not the county's opinion, would hurry that judgment. And there would be no more matters of consequence decided about her, her daughter, or her home, in her absence ever again, by anyone, for any reason, however urgent it seemed at the time. "Agreed," Julian said when she had finished, without a single word of negotiation. "Agreed," Eleanor said. And that, for the moment, was the whole of the treaty. Augusta Harcourt's apology, when it came a fortnight later, came badly, the way genuine ones from proud people often do, not smooth, not complete, delivered standing in Hob Latimer's doorway, because Eleanor had not yet invited her past it. "I have spent 30 years believing that softness killed my husband," Augusta said, "and I raised my son to fear the very thing that might have saved him, if he'd only had more of it, not less. I told myself I was protecting this family by teaching you your place in it. I understand now that what I was protecting was my own certainty. which is a smaller and meaner thing than I let myself believe." She stopped, started again. "I am sorry for the night of your daughter's birth. There is no accounting entry large enough to balance that, and I do not ask you to find one. I ask only that you allow me, some day, to prove I have understood the size of it." Eleanor did not answer at once. She had rehearsed, in her mind, 100 versions of this moment across the summer, and found, now that it had arrived, that none of the rehearsed answers fit. "Some day," she said finally, "is not today. But I heard you say it plainly, and that's more than I expected of you 6 months ago. We'll see what you build from here, Mrs. Harcourt. That's all any of us are ever measured by, in the end." Ashcombe Park's ordinary days, once Eleanor returned to it that October, accumulated the way her father had always said a fortune truly accumulated, not in one dramatic entry, but in 100 small, unremarkable ones that meant nothing alone, and everything added together. Julian moved his chair, without comment, to sit beside hers at the estate desk rather than across from it, and began, over weeks, to ask her opinion before he formed his own, rather than after. He learned to hold his daughter without the careful stiffness of a man handling something breakable, and one evening in November, Eleanor came into the nursery to find him telling Josephine, in perfect seriousness, the entire history of the Ashcombe drainage ditches, as though she were a colleague rather than an infant, and found that the sight of it undid something in her chest she had kept carefully bound since February. There was one relapse in December, a small thing, in the ordinary run of estate business, but Eleanor marked it because she had promised herself she would mark such things rather than let them pass unspoken. Julian, faced with a tenant's request for an extension on rent during a hard month, granted it on his own authority, kindly, without consulting her, exactly as he had been raised to manage such matters alone. "That's not the terms," Eleanor said that evening, not sharply, but plainly. Not because the answer was wrong, it wasn't. Because you decided it without me, out of old habit, the way you were taught to decide everything before you ever had a partner worth consulting. Julian was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. It won't happen again," and the following week, faced with a nearly identical request, he brought it to her first, and she watched him do it, and understood that the correction had taken. It was on a January evening, a year almost to the week since the gravel and the shut door, that he said the rest of it. Standing by the fire with Josephine asleep against his shoulder and the chatelaine keys catching the light on their nail by the door. "I would choose you," he said, "not because a will names you the owner of this house, and not because a county assembly proved my mother wrong in front of everyone we know. I have had a year to watch you build something out of nothing but a ledger and a cold winter, and I would choose you if you owned nothing at all. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some months now. In every small way I know how to show it. I am only now finding the words to say it plainly." "All right," Eleanor said, and this time there was a warmth in it that had not been there in October, and Julian, watching her face in the firelight, understood it for what it was. "All right, then," he said, and something in the room, the house itself, Eleanor would have said, though she had never been given to fancy, seemed, for the first time in a very long while, to let out a breath it had been holding. 2 years passed, the way the good years do, quickly and without much drama to mark them, which Eleanor had come to understand was itself the truest evidence that a house had finally been set right. The fair wage schedule she had built in a single hard summer at Hob Latimer's kitchen table remained posted, permanently, in the estate office, in her own hand, renewed each Michaelmas by her own signature beside Julian's. The Marsh family's eldest boy went, at Eleanor's insistence and expense, to be properly schooled in figures, the first tenant child in 3 generations to leave Ashcombe land, for a trade of his own choosing rather than his father's. A small schoolroom, built the following spring in the shell of an old grain store at the estate's edge, taught reading and reckoning to any tenant child whose parents wished it, and was known, without much ceremony, simply as the Fenwick Room, after a man who had believed a ledger honestly kept, was its own kind of love letter to the people depending on it. Silas Crane made his restitution, in full, over 18 months, under Mr. Prue's exacting supervision, and left the county for one where his face was not yet known, taking with him nothing but the lesson, which Eleanor hoped, without much confidence, that he had actually learned. Augusta Harcourt remained at Ashcombe, in a smaller wing of it, and spent the better part of 2 years proving her some day, in exactly the increments Eleanor had once measured Julian by, small, unremarkable, accumulating. She taught Josephine her letters herself, patiently, in a manner Eleanor had never once seen her extend to anyone in 4 years of marriage, and on the 2nd anniversary of the night on the gravel, she gave Eleanor, without being asked, a full accounting of the household's linen stores, unprompted, simply because it needed doing, and she had noticed, finally, that noticing what needed doing was itself a kind of love she had spent a lifetime failing to offer. Hob Latimer kept his gatehouse and his one book, and was made, at Eleanor's insistence, steward of Ashcombe Park in more than name for the first time in his long service, his own careful figures finally given the authority they had always deserved. The chatelaine keys hung still on their nail, moved now from the gatehouse door to a hook beside the great house's own kitchen entrance, where any hand that needed them could take them down without asking leave, mistress or housekeeper, or, on her 6th birthday, Josephine herself, solemnly permitted to carry them the length of the hall, and back as though she carried the whole of the houses. Trust in her small fist, which, in a manner her grandfather would have entirely approved of, she did. Ashcombe Park, in the 2nd spring after the reckoning, had stopped being a house that held its breath. Visitors remarked on it without quite being able to say what had changed, only that the rooms seemed lighter, the fires burned less like a duty and more like a comfort, and the mistress of the house, when she crossed a room, was greeted by everyone in it, tenant and servant and family alike, the way a person is greeted who has been, for a long while now, entirely and unmistakably seen. She had stopped asking to be wanted. She had made herself, instead, impossible to overlook, not through anger and not through spectacle, but through the plain, accumulating evidence of a life honestly built, one entry at a time, until the sum of it could no longer be argued with by anyone. Least of all the house that had once tried to cast her out into the cold and call it duty. It was not because she had forced them to see her that they finally did. It was because she had simply gone on being exactly, unwaveringly herself, in full daylight, until the seeing became unavoidable, and that was not a thing, in the end, that anyone had the power to take back from her again. There is something quietly satisfying about watching a woman build her own vindication out of nothing but patience and paperwork, and I hope Eleanor's story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was writing it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. I would love to know, in the comments, what you think finally changed Julian's mind. Was it the ledger, the tenants, or watching his daughter grow up in the arms of the mother his family tried to send away? Tell me where you'd have drawn the line, if you'd been in Eleanor's place on that gravel drive. Thank you for spending this time with her story. I'll see you in the next one.